And I really thank you for this opportunity, and I'm going to tell you some things that you just don't normally hear in this manner very often. And the reason I come at it a little bit different because I used to have a ranch in South Dakota, and my beautiful wife was sitting back there. We got married when I was 22 and she was 19, and we got some 640 acres of land from my dad on a contracting deed, and we had some lease land. And 18 years later, we had a 5,000 acre ranch and it was worth $1 million on paper. And obviously, in that time period, we had, become pretty good managers, and she had a tremendous set of books. But it was obviously something was wrong because we was producing lots of wealth out of the ground every year, but we weren't getting ahead in gross worth. But actually trying to get a hold of some cash savings was awful hard. And it seemed like it was very easy to borrow money after I got started and very tough to pay it all back. And I began to wonder just how that worked. And the thing that got me started really into it the most of actually thinking about how things worked was one 3-year period we had $160,000 of profit above all expenses, interest, taxes, and everything. But we still ended up deeper in debt in the end of the 3 years than we did when we started. And I said, there's got to be something wrong, something that I don't have a clue about. And then we went to a management meeting in Denver, Colorado, where we learned lots of things. And it was a very interesting meeting because we was actually studying financial records of actual operation, ranch operations, farm operations kept in conjunction with a management firm that was sponsoring the meeting. And as we was going down the list of them, and we was studying about how to understand and interpret your financial statements and your books, it became very clear that some of them was increasing their wealth more than others, but they was all increasing their indebtedness. And so I asked the speaker, I said, I don't understand. Where's all this money come from? And he said, well, it's just funny money. They just print it off the printing press. And I said, well, I think I understand that, but if that's true, who gets the interest off the printing press? And he said, nobody. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. That can't be true. Because if you printed the money off the printing press and I borrowed it and paid you interest, somebody had to get the printing press, the interest off the printing press. And just like that, he looked across the room and said, what was it that you wanted? And I just simply disappeared. And on the way out the door, a woman walked by and she bumped me with her elbow, and I turned to see what the deal was, and she just looked at me and said, you need to look into the Federal Reserve System. And to be real honest with you, I wasn't sure what she meant. But anyway, we went home and we decided to really study out the system we'd learned there, and we did understand it, and it was clear that the future didn't look much better in the past. We could expand, but how do you get out of debt? And so in the process, I began to study the monetary system. In fact, at that time, I had an 18-year-old boy that just graduated from high school, and we thought he was a pretty bright boy, and we still do. And so I began to ask him a lot of questions if he learned anything in school about some of the things I was wondering about. And one day he looked at me and said, Dad, we just have too much work to do to sit here and discuss this, and you ask me all these questions I don't have the answers to. So I'll make you a deal. If you promise not to ask me any more questions about this, I will do all the work and run the ranch, and you can go in the house and study till you figure out what it is that's bothering you. I looked at him, I said, are you really sincere? He said, absolutely, I can do it, and I will do it. And I said, you just made yourself a deal. And so I went in the house, and I started reading books, and I started writing letters and calling everybody that I could think of. And one of the things I did was contact the state library in South Dakota and begin to ask them for books. It would teach me certain things, and they'd say, well, what are you trying to learn? And what kind, do you have any authors or any titles? And I said, heaven no, I don't have any of that. That's why I called you. I just need to know the information. I want to know answers to certain questions that happened in the past and different things, and have you got any books that I might learn from? And in contacting them one day, we actually contacted the United States government because in 1930-something or other, Roosevelt changed the weight of the gold dollar from 28 to 15 point something. And I couldn't find what he changed it to at that time. And so in there, we had contacted, I talked to the librarian into calling the Washington, D.C. and see if we could find the answers, and they contacted the Dolly Wells first, and she said she didn't know, but if I'd write her a letter, she would probably be able to tell me. Well, we messed around there an hour doing other things, and when I left, I had the answer, but I thought, you know, that was an interesting concept. I think I will just write Dolly Wells. And so I did, and I wrote to Dolly, and I got an answer back, but it was from Russell L. Monk, the General Counsel of the United States Treasury. So then one day I was discussing this, and I had learned quite a few things, I thought, and I said, I wonder what would happen if I would write a letter to the Treasury and ask them these questions. What is money? Where does money come from? How is it created? For whom and what purpose and money is created? And several other questions, actually 13. And at that time I didn't know how to type. And so my wife typed it up and we sent it down there. And Russell Monk answered the letter. And I have a little booklet where I put a compilation of these letters together. And that's really what I want to speak to you about today. Because when he answered my question, he said, when the economy grows and there are more economic transactions, more money is needed to pay for them. And that's very obvious. I mean, if there was 4 people in the society and 4 families and they had $100 apiece, you'd only need 400. Well, if they got to be 20, well, then you'd need, 20 times 100, and if they have it, if each had 100. And so then he went on to say, but the actual creation of money always involves the extension of credit by private commercial banks. And what that really means is there is no money till someone goes to the bank and borrows it at interest. And then he went through and explained how modern banking got started from the Goldsmith concept and all that. And then he said a private commercial bank which has extra reserves from the Fed, by borrowing reserves, for example, can make roughly $6 in loans for every $1 reserves from the reserves it attains from the Fed. How does it get $6 for one? It simply makes a book entry for its loan customers saying you have a deposit of $6 with us. And that's how the banks create money. And I'll show you that on the whiteboard in just a few minutes. They simply create the numbers based upon your promise to pay them back and enter it into your checking account, and like that, money is created. And so he also said you may want to know whether the bank is the one getting the benefit of the new money. Since the bank owns the money, the bank does indeed get the benefit of the new money. Well, now I was beginning to understand that when I borrowed all the money, the bank got the benefit and I did all the work, and they didn't have to go out and feed the cows, get cold, put up hay, or any of those things. But they ended up with the bulk of the money, and that was exactly what I had experienced. Well, now it was becoming kind of clear what was going on. So then I wrote back to Russell Monk, and this letter turned out to be a full 8-page letter, and you can see the copies. I've got books back if you'd like to look. So I wrote back and said, well, another point I need you to clarify, if money is only created by extension of credit and a book entry, where does the money come from to pay the interest on the money I borrowed? And he wrote back and said, the money for paying interest comes from the same place the other money comes from. In other words, it's created by the bank, and you have to go back and borrow that too. Now, I ask you, how can you possibly get out of debt if you have to borrow the money to have it, and then you have to borrow the money to pay the interest? Can you ever get out of debt that way? And then later, a friend of mine from New Jersey wrote a letter to the Treasury, and I have not that in this book, but I have it in another book I wrote. And he says, well, the money you use comes from somebody to pay your interest, has come from somebody else's loan. So if I borrow $100 and I need to pay back $110, I may not have to actually borrow the interest myself. If you borrow the money, then I sell you something, I can get that money to use it to pay my interest.